I'm Sarah Bridges. I am the co-director of training of the Counseling Psychology doctoral program and the faculty ombudsperson at the University of Memphis.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Raskin, professor of psychology at the State University of New York at New Paltz.
Personal construct theory, radical constructivism, and social constructionism, as well as the various psychotherapies they have spawned, can be considered constructivist theories. Though these approaches differ in some of their theoretical assumptions, they share the central idea that psychological meanings are best viewed as constructions rather than reproductions of the presumed external world they map. We use the familiar Constructivist Theories designation throughout this presentation, although some clinicians prefer the more inclusive term constructive theories to account for subtle yet important distinctions between constructivism and social constructionism, which both focus on indirectly knowing the world via humanly invented constructions. However, they differ their views of the primary origins of human constructions. Constructivism attributes meaning construction mainly to individuals, while social constructionism emphasizes social-relational, linguistic, and co-constructive processes. Nonetheless, for continuity with past ways referring to this family of therapies, we subsume them under the banner of constructivist theories. The different forms of therapy beneath this banner, including personal construct therapy, coherence therapy, narrative therapy, and context-centered therapy, constitute a family of distinct but related meaning-based approaches. Herein, we outline key constructivist theories and therapy approaches. We review research evidence for them, as well as opportunities and challenges related to clinical training.
Precursors of modern constructivist theories can be found throughout the history of philosophy. Let's mention a few examples here. The 17th century Italian philosopher Giambattista Vico is often identified as one of the first full-fledged constructivist thinkers. His work, which, like George Kelly's personal construct psychology in the 1950s, was less appreciated in its time than in later years, emphasizes the idea that human beings actively construct knowledge, and that these constructions don't directly mirror a presumed external world. Constructivist themes can also be identified in the empirical and idealist philosophies of George Berkeley and David Hume. For instance, Ernst von Glasersfeld, a co-founder of radical constructivism, contends that Berkeley's emphasis on the experience of time, motion, and causation as dependent on the reflexivity of the observing subject constitutes an example of early constructivist theorizing. Similarly, Immanuel Kant's philosophy, with its emphasis on how the flux of immediate experience is filtered through categories of thought and transformed into something meaningful by the person, reflects the basic constructivist position. Kant distinguished noumena, things in the world beyond human reason, from phenomena, which is our experience of noumena. And he said we can never know the former directly. Along these lines, Ernst von Glasersfeld notes Kant's very constructivist-sounding assertion that while it's necessary to assume that noumena exist, they ultimately remain unknowable. These ideas were later formalized more fully by Hans Weihinger in his philosophy of as if. Weihinger maintained that people invent explanatory fictions to make sense of the world, and then they live as if these fictions are true. Von Glasersfeld highlights the significance of this to constructivist thought, especially Weihinger's recognition that the heuristic fictions we devise constitute tools for the mental organization of experience, and that these mentally organized experiences shouldn't be taken for reality itself. Now, social constructionism shares many of the same philosophical roots as constructivism, but it especially draws on approaches that stress the co-created negotiation of shared social realities. Of note are the Sophist thinkers of ancient Greece, who espoused an anti-foundationalist and anti-essentialist philosophy that was perhaps the first to formally recognize the constructive and relational basis of human knowledge. The centrality of human involvement in socially constructing shared experiential truths is famously reflected in the words of Protagoras, the Sophist philosopher, who boldly asserted that man is the measure of all things. Similarly, another Greek Sophist thinker, Gorgias, anticipated modern social constructionism by locating experiential truth and reality in the verbal practices of the community, not in some independent context-free world. Sophism was misunderstood and labeled by Plato and other non-Sophist Greek philosophers as a nihilistic approach that denied reality, a criticism that social constructionists deem unfair and continue to counter today. Now that we've talked a little bit about history, next we turn to modern constructivist and constructionist theories that build on these historical antecedents.
Originating in the work of mid-20th century American psychologist George Kelly, some consider personal construct psychology, PCP, the first modern constructivist psychological theory. Rooted in the presumption that empirical sensory responses are only rendered coherent by proactively constructing meaningful accounts about them, personal construct psychology holds that each person devises a unique collection of personal constructs to organize and make sense of experience. Each personal construct consists of two poles that, taken as a whole, consist of an idea and its perceived opposite. Personal construct systems are hierarchical, with some constructs taking priority over others. Critically, everyone's construct system is individualized. For example, for Olga, the opposite pole of happy is bored, but for Pedro, the opposite of happy is alone. Thus, the ways that Olga and Pedro construe happiness are quite different. Kelly referred to the infinite ways to interpret events as constructive alternativism and moved away viewing objective truth as fully knowing. Instead, to understand a given person's psychological experience, we must comprehend their unique personal constructs. To that end, PCP therapists have developed a rich array of assessment techniques for eliciting and mapping personal constructs. In contrast to traditional diagnostic systems such as the DSM and ICD that assign clients to nomothetic medical model categories of disorder, personal construct psychology assesses clients idiographically by identifying and evaluating across time ongoing changes in their personal constructs, a process known as Transitive Diagnosis. For introductions to personal construct theory, please see Bannister and Francella and Epting et al.
Like personal construct psychology, radical constructivism contends that people know the world indirectly via their constructions of it. According to radical constructivism, people are closed systems, and by this they mean that information never gets in or out. Instead, internal meaning-making processes are initiated when triggered by stimuli in an assumed but never directly knowable external world. Thus, rather than taking in the scent of a flower, the flower stimulates built-in perceptual structures whose activity constructs the experience of smell. This constructive process, in which we're only in touch with our internal responses, occurs in all psychological experiences, from cognitive knowledge, for example, of how electricity works, to feelings of joy, anger, and despair, for example, in response to getting married, being betrayed, or losing a loved one. Radical constructivism is radical because it contends that people are only in contact with their constructions. The world beyond those constructions is the trigger that precipitates meaning-making processes. But the psychological and biological structures of the individual, once set in motion, are what shape and determine experience. In psychotherapy, radical constructivism holds that people construct their experiential worlds. Internal meaning-making processes constitute experience as much or more than external forces. Therapy, informed by radical constructivism, attends to disrupting the structure-determined responses and processes that have led clients to reified meanings that keep them stuck. For more on the basics of radical constructivism, you can see the theorizing of folks like J. Efron, Umberto Maturana, Francisco Varela, and Ernst von Glasersfeld.
PCP and radical constructivism generally see meaning as individually constructed, but social constructionism tends to view this as solipsistic and instead stresses meaning as something people create together, socially, via their ongoing relationships. Social constructionists speak of discourses, which they define as communal practices, representations, images, and meanings, including collective ways of talking and writing about things, that constitute knowledge and yield shared social truths. For example, the discourse of romantic loves brings into being or supports forms of life that we often take for granted as universally true rather than socially constructed. Thus, social constructionists believe that frameworks of understanding are co-constructed through social practices and language. How we talk and interact shapes the shared social understandings we accept as true. Because the social and relational practices that yield these communally shared truths typically go unexamined, their constructed origins are often overlooked. Social constructionist therapy, therefore, is highly attentive to therapists' clinical constructions, which originate in often taken for granted discourses and practices amongst themselves. Professionally shared constructions about clients are useful, but it is also valuable to consider clients' views of their difficulties. Rather than expecting clients to fit therapists' theories of problematic situations or established diagnostic categories, social constructionist therapists help clients to analyze the linguistic and relational practices used to define problem situation. This process, which social constructionists called discourse analysis, provides insight into how people co-create narratives that delineate problems and how to remediate them. Like all human interactions, therapy involves client and therapist co-constructing shared meanings. Close attention is paid to linguistic and relational dynamics, the discourses from which the therapist and client operate, and how these discourses impact the therapy process. Social constructionism maintains that the indeterminacy of language means that no final understanding of what is said can be assumed. All utterances remain open to further interpretation. With our focus both on the use of language and the importance of social and cultural practices in constituting what is expected as true, social constructionist therapy shares a great deal with multicultural and feminist therapies, which propose that it is impossible to separate individuals from their environments and to treat them as though they did not exist in context filled with prejudice, bias, and sociocultural pressure. Failure to consider this is to treat clients unjustly. Further, social constructionist therapy tends to focus minimally on the individual self and instead examines the blending of individuals in the social milieu. Although truly selfless psychotherapy is rare, social constructionist informed therapy emphasizes raising client awareness of how internalized social discourses and practices contribute to their difficulties. Role plays, experiential exercises, journal writing, and articulating and critiquing previously unquestioned social constructions are used to highlight clients' theories about the problems that have brought them to therapy. For comprehensive overviews of social constructionist theory, please see Burr 2015 and Gergen 2015.
George Kelly was a therapy integrationist before the term was popularized, encouraging clinicians to draw from all available therapy techniques. His main therapeutic innovation was fixed-role therapy, in which clients write an intimate character sketch of themselves in the third person, as if describing a character in a book or a play. The therapist revises the sketch, making subtle changes and renaming the main character. It's important that the changes not be so significant that the client will have difficulty enacting them, while being different enough that they permit the client to entertain alternative constructions of self and others. For example, if Joe writes that, quote, Joe is an explosive person who often gets into trouble because he's unable to control his temper, end of quote, his therapist might rewrite it to say that, quote, Bill can become extremely angry, angrier than most people he knows, but he's able to express these feelings in socially appropriate ways, end of quote. After discussing the revised sketch with the therapist, the client undertakes an experiment by behaving as the revised sketch character would for a week or two. Playing a part in this manner permits clients to test new ways of construing and behaving without feeling defensive or self-inconsistent. After enacting the fixed role sketch, clients typically report novel experiences that yield new ways of construing. This is consistent with personal construct psychology's conception of behavior as an experiment. So let's talk about a brief case example. Tess was a college student in therapy to address social anxiety. She reported being too shy to attend campus parties, and she felt as if she had few friends at school. Tess was asked to play a fixed role of someone less reticent than she about social interactions with unfamiliar people. In her own sketch, Tess described herself in the third person as a socially anxious and shy person who rarely, if ever, takes social risks. Her therapist provided a revised sketch of Sara, someone who doesn't always take social risks, but will do so when interested in getting to know new people. Tess played Sara in daily life for 2 weeks. And to her welcome surprise, she reported having greatly enjoyed not just one, but several parties while playing her fixed-role character. Tess embraced the more socially adventurous constructs she experimented with through the fixed-role enactment. Consequently, she revised her constructs in a manner that opened social possibilities that had previously seemed impossible to her. She ceased construing herself as irreparably shy and socially phobic, and instead she shifted to a more nuanced construal of herself as a reserved and quiet person who nonetheless could effectively engage in social situations when she wished to. By using her fixed role enactment as a means to test new constructs, Tess put Kelly's maxim of behavior is an experiment into action. As a result of fixed role therapy, new options for construing and living became available to her.
Originally developed by Bruce Ecker and Laurel Holy in the 1990s, coherence therapy combines the ideographic, meaning-based ideas of personal construct psychology with research on memory reconsolidation drawn from neuroscience. It posits that behind any current problem or symptom lies a compelling way of understanding how the world works that necessitates the presence of that problem or symptom. As has been discussed earlier, constructs, mental templates for understanding the world, are developed to increase predictability, which lessens anxiety. This, in turn, allows for safety, well-being, or justice. Once a construction of events is locked in, it becomes an unquestioned and largely unnoticed part of how the world is understood. For example, a child who is confronted with rage from a parent and feels unloved might, in the moment of heightened emotion, create the emotional understanding that, when people are angry with me, they no longer love me. In that moment, the solution to this painful understanding is to ensure others are never angry again, which works well for creating safety and well-being during childhood, but becomes problematic in later life when being assertive or able to tolerate the occasional displeasure of others is necessary for adult living. The current problem, not being assertive, is a solution to an even greater problem. When people are angry with me, they no longer love me. The goal of therapy becomes discovering the original emotional learning or schema that created the solution, and then disconfirming and dissolving it into a more adaptive and expansive way. As an example, Ethan sought therapy because his habit of always turning in his graduate school assignments at the last minute had become a significant problem. He said he was just one out-of-ink print cartridge at the wrong time away from failing out of graduate school. Additionally, doing his schoolwork at the last minute caused him personal anxiety and created conflict with his husband, Mark. Ethan identified his problem as procrastination and said he had tried many techniques to fix it, like making lists, working in small chunks, devising a schedule, creating rewards, etc., but that nothing had worked. Ethan was constantly apologizing to Mark and saying he would do better. Mark, an attorney in a small law firm, tried to be understanding but did not comprehend why Ethan could not get his work done early so there would be less stress in their lives. Coming from a coherence therapy methodology, the goal was to see how procrastinating was unconsciously compellingly necessary for Ethan and exemplified his own agency rather than some sort of pathology. Working experientially, the therapist helped Ethan to imagine finishing a school assignment early. Making the situation as real as possible helped Ethan to feel what finishing early would be like for him. Ethan initially responded that it felt amazing to be done early, and he felt relief. When asked to contemplate if there was any part of him that was uncomfortable with getting his work done early, Ethan sat quietly for a minute and then replied yes. For Ethan, there was a part of him that did not want to get done early because he imagined that his husband, Mark, would want to look it over and correct the grammar, spelling, and content. The idea of getting his work handed back to him with red corrections all over it would feel too much like the overwhelming criticism Ethan experienced growing up. Being with Mark was one place where he felt totally safe and accepted. He feared that introducing an opening for even constructive criticism would ruin the safe haven he had created with his husband. Until then, Ethan was unaware that his procrastination was a tactic to keep his relationship safe and ward off the negative criticism he had experienced in his life. Once Ethan and his therapist were able to make conscious the emotional learning that corrections equal devastating criticism, many other instances where correction was viewed as helpful rather than critical also came to mind. Because Ethan's constructed knowing that correction always means criticism and correction can mean help both felt true but could not be true at the same time, the more limiting of the two lost its hold on his life and allowed him room to get his work done early.
Context-centered therapy, developed by J. Efron, combines aspects of personal construct theory and radical constructivism. Its constructivist underpinnings are reflected in its emphasis on contexts, which are sets of psychological assumptions that constitute and frame experience. Two contexts of particular importance are mind and self. Efron defines these terms in novel ways that differ from their typical use, presenting them as meaning-constituting contexts rather than essential structures of personality. When operating from the context of mind, people adopt an entirely defensive posture. They wish to stay safe and avoid losing or being one down. The mind keeps itself safe by trying to dominate and control others, and by avoiding all risk. The mind never moves beyond its protect and defend orientation. And while it serves an evolutionary purpose, happiness is not on the mind's radar. During the coronavirus pandemic, the hoarding of toilet paper and other goods reflected the mind's self-protective, albeit utterly irrational, me-first defensive orientation. Similarly, the mind is in evidence whenever others tell us we're wrong about something. And in response, we dig in our heels further. This explains why telling someone they must do something often elicits the exact opposite impulse from them, and perhaps illuminates the strong but seemingly incomprehensible resistance in some quarters to COVID-19 vaccine requirements. The mind never wants to lose, to be wrong, or to be unsafe. By contrast, the self is a broader context than the mind, one that emphasizes relatedness, connection, and acceptance. When approaching the world from the context of self, we are generous, caring, kind, empathic, and appreciative. We accept others and their experiences, and we do not shame them or make them feel wrong for responding as they do. The goal of context-centered therapy is to help clients be mindful of the mind, to become better able to observe when it's getting the best of them. Importantly, people can only observe the mind by stepping outside the mind's context into that of the self. Therapeutically, awareness of mind loosens its hold on us. In many respects, context-centered therapy builds on the radical constructivist idea of people as structure-determined systems. By observing the mind, we accept and appreciate the ways in which our systems operate and shape our experience. Ironically, this awareness provides a degree of influence over the system itself. So as a case example, let's talk about Billy, a 19-year-old male who sought therapy because he was having a difficult time getting over a recent breakup. He couldn't stop thinking about his ex-girlfriend, Lena, especially how quickly she had found a new boyfriend with whom to replace him. Billy reported trying, and failing, for several months to stop replaying key moments with Lena in his head, or feeling sad about the relationship's demise. He worried that he was becoming a, quote, obsessive-compulsive, and he expressed disappointment that he had been unable to follow the well-intentioned, but ultimately unhelpful advice of his best friend to simply focus on other things and actively avoid ruminating about the breakup and his feelings about it. Billy's therapist empathized with him and with his plight, and shared with him, both verbally and via reading materials, context-centered therapy's notions of mind and self. Billy and his therapist then discussed how Billy's thoughts and feelings about the breakup reflected the mind in action. Billy's mind, wanting to protect him at all costs, interpreted being broken up with as, quote-unquote, losing, and being, quote-unquote, one down, even though he recognized this was not the right relationship for him. The therapist noted that Billy's mind was operating just as designed, ruminating about perceived dangers, desperately wishing to even the score, and taking personally Lena's breaking up with him as an indicator of his unattractiveness and unlovability, as opposed to it merely telling us about her unique feelings in response to him. The latter idea was illustrated to Billy when it was pointed out that some people do not find movie star George Clooney appealing, and that no matter who one is, one can never expect to be everyone's cup of tea. It was recommended that Billy permit his mind to do its thing, and that he simply try to observe his mind in action without trying to stop it. Something that can only be accomplished by shifting from mind to the more accepting and empathic perspective of self. Once Billy began noting when his mind was doing its thing, he found it bothered him less, and less intensely, too. Awareness of the human tendency to alternate between the mind's unremitting negativism and alarmism, and the self's acceptance and empathy, helped to normalize Billy's experience. Although he continued to occasionally experience distress over the end of the relationship, he found himself able to observe, accept, and be less impacted by his mind. Perhaps because he began to see its rumblings as experiencing constituting psychological constructions instead of indisputable universal truths.
Narrative therapy holds the stories we tell ourselves, both positive and negative, provide the framework of meaning that guide our lives. These stories, or narratives, are co-created through interaction with dominant sociocultural messages and personal experiences, which then become internalized and viewed as simply how the world is, rather than as revisable stories. Narratives become problematic when they pathologize clients, limit their options, or lead to psychological distress. A key aspect of narrative therapy is to uncover and deconstruct problem-saturated stories and to reauthor them to provide agency and more expansive possibilities. The process of reauthoring a problem-saturated story often involves externalizing the problem, a technique through which clients recognize that they are not the problem is the problem. Externalization uses deconstructive or reauthoring questions designed to help clients view problems as something external to themselves, which can be resisted, rather than as innate and immutable personality flaws or characteristics. Questions such as, what role does the problem have on your life? In what ways the problem act like it's your friend when it's not? When are you the most vulnerable to the influences of the problem? And who in your life would be the least surprised at your ability to stand up to the problem, can all be useful in mapping the influence of the problem and encouraging clients to think of it as external to themselves. Narrative therapists adopt a collaborative and empathic position that helps clients identify exceptions, times when they were able to act in ways that countered their predominant problematic story. Highlighting these sparkling moments helps to bring the unnoticed small wins into awareness and serves as the germinal beginnings of a newly authored story. For example, Lamont came to therapy at the request of his girlfriend Sherry, who said he needed to work on his anger. While he had never been violent or angry with Sherry, he would often yell at other drivers on the highway, drive aggressively, get easily frustrated with slow service at restaurants, and experience conflicts at work around some stupid things, like how much room was being used in the refrigerator in the break room. When meeting his therapist for the first time, Lamont said he was just an angry person and that he had been his entire life. His mother sometimes referred to him as the Hulk, and he would talk to him about needing to calm down, especially because being an angry black man is dangerous, which in turn would make him angrier. Lamont's therapist helped him to externalize the problem of anger, rather than continuing to internalize it as simply something he was. Therapy explored how the dominant narrative, being an angry person, restricted Lamont's options in frustrating or unjust situations. Treating anger as something separate from Lamont that often got the best of him, he and his therapist discovered how anger acted like it was a powerful way to be heard and recognized. However, all too often, it reduced Lamont's chances of being respected and getting his needs met. This was not to say that anger was to be squashed at every turn. Rather, anger could be more productively viewed as an external force that he could choose to listen to or not, instead of being something he innately was. The fact that he had never been overtaken by anger in his long-term relationship with Sherry was a clear exception to the dominant story of always being angry, which provided the therapist and Lamont with the beginnings of an alternative narrative. Through curious questioning, deconstruction of the dominant problem-saturated narrative, that at core he was an angry person, and the creation of an audience for a new story, that anger was a choice he could make, Lamont and his therapist were able to diminish the destructive impact of anger in his life.
Because constructivist psychotherapy emphasizes the unique experience of clients and how their experiential realities influence their problem situations, it has been implemented with a variety of clinical populations. Although they tend to be skeptical of medical model diagnostic categories, constructivist and constructionist therapists have applied their techniques to clients diagnosed with anxiety, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, substance use disorders, stuttering, psychosis, autism, and post-traumatic stress. They have also used their approach to address grief and loss, childhood issues, divorce, family therapy, multicultural issues, and more. Of course, as with all therapies, the issue of access to services remains challenging. In the United States, at least, clients who lack health insurance often struggle to gain access to psychotherapy. Perhaps because they are less well known and have accrued a smaller research base than cognitive behavioral interventions, constructivist therapies are not always covered by insurance. Even in countries with nationalized healthcare systems, constructivist therapists have had to advocate for coverage of their forms of therapy.
Critics accuse constructivist perspectives of having several limitations, including being anti-realist, anti-scientific, and fostering an anything-goes relativism. Constructivist theorists aggressively push back against such critiques, arguing that constructivist epistemologies value science and the viable knowledge systems it generates, while also remaining committed to the idea that what goes is constrained as much by our constructions as it is the furniture of the world. In other words, constructivists can and do believe in the value of scientific constructions, while still maintaining that such constructions are human understandings and not truth itself. Nonetheless, a significant challenge facing constructivist therapies is that they are rooted in an epistemological worldview not shared by most clinicians, and this limits their influence. Add to this that constructivist therapists can befuddle newcomers with a great deal of jargon, and it becomes clear why their influence has not been as extensive as they would like.
Personal construct therapists have long conducted research into the effectiveness of their approach. Meta-analyses of existing studies by Linda Viney found personal construct therapy to be more effective than no treatment, standard care, or waitlist controls, which is consistent with research by David Winner. Personal construct therapy appears to be effective across a range of presenting problems, yielding modest but reliable effects. For specific presenting problems, effect sizes are large for treating anxiety and fear, small to medium for trauma and stress, physical problems and aging, and problematic behavior, but almost non-existent for psychosis and delusion. Nonetheless, there is evidence for the effectiveness of personal construct therapy for numerous specific problems, including agoraphobia and stuttering. Further, a recently published research protocol outlines a randomized controlled trial currently being conducted on personal construct therapy for depressed women diagnosed with fibromyalgia. So there is a small, but growing evidence base for personal construct therapy.
There is also a solid and expanding evidence base for the effectiveness of narrative therapies. Although not studied as often as cognitive behavioral therapy and some other better-known therapies, research suggests that narrative therapy is effective with a variety of populations and problems, including young adults with autism, children working on social and emotional skill development, children diagnosed with social phobia, children diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactive disorder, couples struggling with a fear of intimacy, women with communication issues who report low marital satisfaction, individuals diagnosed with obsessive-compulsive disorder, and incarcerated adolescents undergoing rehabilitation. Case studies also suggest narrative therapy can be helpful for treating eating disorders, but more controlled studies are needed. Further, a study of narrative therapy for moderate depression found it to be effective for clients who completed treatment. Due to the high dropout rate of participants in the narrative therapy condition, the investigators called for additional research before recommending narrative therapy as a treatment for depression. However, a follow-up study found that participants in the earlier study were highly likely to have maintained recovery from depressive symptoms, although they were less likely to have maintained recovery from interpersonal problems. Overall, the small evidence base for narrative therapy finds it effective for numerous presenting problems, and additional research is called for.
Coherence therapy and context-centered therapy don't yet have much empirical support, perhaps because they're relatively new and unknown approaches. To its credit, coherence therapy has incorporated existing memory reconsolidation research into its theoretical foundations, but studies of its effectiveness have yet to be conducted. Given the paucity of current research, studies on the effectiveness of coherence and context-centered therapies would be worthwhile. That said, although a fair amount of research has been conducted examining the effectiveness of other constructivist therapies, some clinicians have expressed concern about whether traditional research approaches, with their emphasis on manualized treatment protocols to remediate symptoms of sometimes suspect medical model diagnostic categories, are always the best means for investigating the efficacy of therapy. Given that constructivist perspectives tend to challenge the medical model and its generally logical positivist epistemological assumptions, exclusive reliance on research methods wedded to the logical positivist tradition may not fully capture the utility and the effectiveness of constructivist therapies.
A grounding in epistemology can be helpful when it comes to being trained in constructivist psychotherapies. Exposure to philosophical debates about realism, idealism, and essentialism help prepare students to explore the role of meaning-making and its connection, or lack thereof, to a knowable external reality. Along these lines, grappling with the notion of experiential reality as personally and relationally constructed allows trainees to comprehend constructivist approaches to psychotherapy more easily. Unfortunately, there are few schools or programs that specifically focus on constructivist psychotherapies in the United States. However, many academic programs teach constructivist theories as part of a larger overview of theoretical approaches to psychotherapy. In Italy, there is the School of Constructivist Psychotherapy in Padua and the School of Specialization in Constructivist-Oriented Psychotherapies in Florence. In the UK, there is the Constructivist and Existential College, a UK council for psychotherapy that accredits training programs in constructivist or existential psychotherapy. In Spain, there is a master's in cognitive and social therapy at the University of Barcelona, and Ramon Llull University, which has considerable constructivist theory and content. Further, many online programs offer continuing education, classes, and videos on constructivist psychotherapy.
Constructivist psychotherapy offers clinicians a variety of creative methods for examining and revising meaning-making. Personal construct therapy, narrative therapy, coherence therapy, and context-centered therapy offer 4 concrete examples of the constructivist approach in action. In balancing the importance of biological, psychological, and social factors in the construction of human meaning without reducing human experience to any one of these factors, constructivist approaches to therapy provide nuanced and innovative therapeutic theories and applications that will likely continue to influence clinical practice.